Hello, and welcome to Quantum Mythology. My name is Richard Hartnett. I've been a teacher for over 30 years of metaphysics in spiritually based classes. One of the things I like to do the most is look at stories. We all love stories. Look around. You see that we have a lot of interest in movies, television shows, DVDs, and cable. It's very important to us. But when it comes to stories, I think there's a lot more going on than just simple entertainment. We look to stories to give us answers for how to deal with challenges in life. Before we had therapy, we used to sit around campfires and tell stories. Now, when it comes to stories, there are two types of stories. There are literal stories, a recounting of some event that actually happened to someone. And then there's fantasy. Now, fantasy often has components in it of magical creatures and supernatural powers. And as far as we know, no one has ever actually experienced what goes on in a fantasy. But those are equally important to us. In fact, maybe even more so. Now, another word for fantasy is myth. Now, it is possible for a literal story to grow into a myth. Let me give you an example of what that might look like. It's very likely that there was a man named Moses who did lead the Israelites out of Egypt to the Promised Land. And there are many components within that story that are very feasible. But there's also some pretty magical things that happen in that story. And it is possible that maybe the myth grew out of the literal story. Let me tell you or give you an example of what that might look like. Let's say someone went up to Moses and said, "Where did you get this idea that you should lead our people out of Egypt?" And what Moses said was, "I was on a mountain tending to my sheep, and one day I saw a vision. There was a burning bush, and out of that bush I heard a voice say to me that I needed to lead the people out of slavery in Egypt." Well, the other person might have heard that as if Moses literally saw a burning bush in front of him and that he literally heard a voice. But it is equally likely that Moses might have had a vision in his mind where he heard and saw that information. It's also possible that maybe he had a dream. So sometimes literal stories do grow into legends or mythology. It's important for us to understand the difference between a myth and an urban legend. An urban legend is a story that gets circulated amongst people. Today we find a lot of these kinds of stories on the internet. And there's something about that story that is pretty amazing. In fact, it's pretty much unbelievable. An example of that would be there was a story about someone having a pill that could convert water into fuel. And when we looked into that story, not just me, but scientists or other people, investigators, they could find no foundation for that story. So oftentimes, urban legends are nothing more than a made-up story. But when it comes to myth, we have to remember what Joseph Campbell said to us. Just because a myth is not literally true does not mean that it holds no truth. In fact, I would argue that myths often are more valuable to us because they hold a deep universal truth for us, something that is most applicable to dealing with the challenges of life. Now, when it comes to myth, we have to remember that myths are not literal. They speak to us metaphorically. They use symbols to convey their truths. But myths will endure over time because they hold deep universal truths. Universal truths about how we can deal with life. In my first book, The New Old Gods, I went through several Greek stories and showed people how to look at those stories and make them relevant to their life. An example of that would be the story of the Medusa. We've all had Medusa kinds of experiences where we fell in love and acted inappropriately, and that caused us a great deal of pain and difficulty. Unfortunately today, I see a tendency within our society to dismiss mythology as having no value because it's not literally true. But when we do that, we are abandoning one of the greatest resources for wisdom that we have. Even when we don't know what the symbols in a myth will mean, we often find ourselves emotionally reacting to the story because we sense that there's a deep level of truth in it. And I find it interesting that sometimes, although people literally are holding on to a story in a literal way, thinking it literally happened, what's really going on is that they're holding on to the story because they don't want to lose the truth that is hidden in the story. And even if they don't know what that truth is, they will hold on to it. It's much more useful for us to be able to look at myth as metaphor to understand how that story actually becomes relevant, so that we're not just worshiping the story for the sake of worshiping it. It's actually something that becomes applicable and useful in our lives. One of the key ways that we know that a myth is valuable to us is because we have a strong emotional reaction to it. Now, there are two types of myths. There are the ancient myths that have been passed on from generation to generation for thousands of years, and they endure because they hold universal truths that are valuable to all men. But there's also another kind of myth that happens, and that is myths that emerge spontaneously within our culture. Now, often the myths that are emerging because somehow our culture has lost its way, has abandoned some essential truths in the pursuit of some sort of egotistical desire. So when you see stories spontaneously emerge within a culture, that's a very important thing to pay attention to, because those stories might very well be telling us some truths that we are not looking at as a culture. An example of that would be the stories about zombies that has been very, very prominent in our media lately. You find TV shows and even movies about zombies, and I think that's because they're drawing our attention. That story is trying to draw our attention to something that our society as a whole is choosing to not look at. And in my first actual interpretive session in quantum mythology, I'm going to go through the story of zombies, and I'm going to give you the ability to look at that story symbolically to see what that story is telling us. There's one other thing I want to point out about myth, and that is that myths often have very similar forms from culture to culture. Not identical forms, but when you look at the stories, what you see is that there's something very, very similar to them. An example of that would be all cultures have some sort of story about the creation. How was it that man came onto the scene? We all have our mythological stories that give an explanation. And although they might appear to be fanciful, meaningless stories, when we learn how to interpret those stories symbolically rather than literally, you'll find that they actually give us a deeper understanding of what was happening. Now, when you go from culture to culture and you compare the stories, as Carl Jung did, what you find is that those stories that are very common from culture to culture are what we call, or what Carl Jung came up with this term, an archetypal story. Now, what an archetype means is that this is a story that's sort of essential to the human experience. That's why all cultures have some variation of the same story. An archetypal story is a story of utmost importance to us because it holds great truth that we need to look at and understand. Carl Jung spent a significant part of his life going all over the world to research stories. And one of the things he did is he went to hidden tribes and hidden away civilizations to see what their stories were. And once he found a way to understand their stories, he found that the presence of archetypes were there as well as everywhere else. But the only way that we can really understand an archetypal story is by learning how to look at the individual stories symbolically. If we get caught up in saying that our cultural story is right in a literal way and the other story that's not the same as ours in a literal way is wrong, what we do is we end up arguing instead of really understanding the deeper truth. So it's valuable to us to recognize that each story within each culture holds a piece of the truth, but no story holds all the truth. Now, one of my favorite stories that really illustrates this point is the story of the 6 blind men and the elephant. Now there were 6 blind men that used to travel around together, and one day they were making their way along a road, and they could tell that there was a great deal of excitement happening up ahead of them. And so they asked a man nearby if he would tell them what was going on. And the man said, "Why? There's an elephant up ahead and everybody's very excited about this." And so the 6 blind men said, "Please, could you take us up so that we might experience the elephant? We've never encountered one before." And the man did that. So afterwards, the 6 blind men gathered together and they started to share with each other their experience of the elephant. And the first one said, "Well, I was quite surprised to discover that the elephant was a wall." And the second one said, "What? The elephant's not a wall, he's a tree." And the third one said, "No, you're both wrong. The elephant is a spear." And then another one said, "I don't know what you guys encountered, but the elephant that I encountered was a snake." And the last one said, "I didn't have that experience either. I experienced that the elephant was a great big leaf." And they would spend their days from that point forward arguing about what the elephant was. Now, each of them had a piece of the truth, but not any of them had the whole truth. And I think that's the same way with us and mythology. Each culture has a piece of the truth, but no culture has the total whole truth. Now that leads me to why I call this class Quantum Mythology. The word quantum comes out of quantum physics. In quantum physics, one of the problems they had when they were examining what was going on the subatomic level is that they could not make complete and accurate predictions about what might occur at any given time. What they came up with instead was a field or a conglomeration of probabilities. They called this the Copenhagen interpretation. This was pioneered primarily by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. Now, we know that Einstein didn't like this, and he kept looking for a better way to describe what was going on in the subatomic, but was never actually able to find that. So what they did is, by putting together all of these different interpretations, they felt that they covered all the possibilities so that collectively they could have a fairly accurate presentation but not make an accurate prediction. So the idea is, by examining a quantity of information, they came closer to the truth. And that's the same idea with quantum mythology. By examining all of the different myths, learning how to interpret the myths symbolically, learning how to interpret the metaphors of the myths, we get a closer picture of the truth. But we have to remember that there are no stories that have the complete and final truth. So if we don't have the complete and final truth, what's the point? The point is that the more you're willing to seek out the truth, the more you're willing to seek out answers, the closer you're going to get to being able to deal with the challenges and difficulties of your life. It's certainly more worthwhile to seek the truth than it is to turn a blind eye towards it. So when you feel like you've lost your way, when you feel as if you're wandering around the darkness, that's exactly the time when you need a good story to help you find your way. I believe mythology offers us many answers when we learn how to interpret myth. So what I'm saying is that when you learn how to decode the messages hidden in myths, you'll begin to understand how to decode the messages that are hidden in the stories of your life. Not only in your literal life, but also you'll begin to understand your dreams, because dreams are conveyed to us in a symbolic language. So my first presentation, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be on zombies. I'm going to follow that one up with a presentation on vampires, and then I will do one on mutants. Now those are all modern myths, if you will, but they have great meaning when we can learn to understand them. And I am going to also, in this class, go back and look at some of the ancient stories, some of the Greek stories, some of the Egyptian stories, some of the Christian stories, and decode those and to see how they hold a level of meaning and value that's deeper than just a superficial reading or interpretation of those stories. Now, if you're enjoying what I'm doing on this site, then please support it. Let me know. Give me feedback. Write to me here or on my Facebook account under Richard Hartnett. I also do a daily tarot card reading. It's sort of the wisdom of the day kind of thing on my Facebook account, so you can follow that. I'm available for spiritual counseling and tarot readings. You can support my work by having a reading with me. Just write to me at my email address, quantumspirit@eastcentral.com, and we can arrange something. Readings are available via Skype, so you don't have to be in the Denver metro area in order to have a reading. So I thank you for coming today and watching this presentation. I hope that you found something valuable in it. Be sure to let me know. You can follow me on Facebook, here on YouTube. I also have a Twitter account. So I look forward to interacting with you in the future, and I thank you for giving me the most precious thing that you have, which is your attention. Goodbye.